Hello everyone, I hope today finds you well. A big welcome to any new subscribers. I've taken a look at the chart of RFK Jr. and I've been smitten by the astrology surrounding this man, the family, the history. I am so significantly held back by the lack of a birth time. I've messaged his campaign group to plead with them to find out, but so far there hasn't been a response. If any viewers are aware of birth time, please let me know. The activity in this man's chart is pretty intense, and the birth time is make or break for me. So let's have a look at this fascinating chart and work out which parts of it are going to feature most prominently during 2024. As you can see, we have a T-square going on in this chart. On the one hand, we have a big stellium in Capricorn, and we could expect intelligence and charm, sociability, logic. We would expect ambition, astuteness, and normally respectability. But we need to factor in that opposition from Uranus. This will add a big dollop of unpredictability, the iconoclast, a freedom seeker, a rebel. We have the moon nearby Uranus. I should add here that that moon could be anywhere between 3 and 17 degrees of Cancer, depending on what part of the day RFK was born. His son RFK III does actually have a conjunction between Moon, Uranus and Mars. That moon is factoring in extra sensitivity, the ability to care for others. And at the apex we have Neptune. Neptune can represent many things: loss, erosion, spirituality, deception. And this is the part of the T-square with which Robert is most likely to identify. I suspect many issues are caught up in this T-square, including the loss of the father, addiction, escapism, and also sacrifice for others. We can also see Pluto there, forming quincunxes to a few of the planets in that Capricorn stellium. These can be difficult aspects because the signs don't have anything in common with each other. But within the tension, Pluto will give Robert a great awareness of power structures, of power interplay between people, an awareness of when manipulation is taking place, and indeed a capacity for manipulation ourselves. And this Plutonic theme is confirmed by looking further at the sign of Scorpio, with Mars and Saturn both placed there. There's tremendous power and depth wrapped up in this one. We could experience crises in life, but our staying power is exhaustive, and the superficial is not of interest to us. We are deep dive. And in fact, Mars is a very important planet in RFK's chart. It's in its own sign, and it's the dispositor of Saturn, which in turn disposits that Capricorn stellium. So it's a key player. And the moon too is very strong in its own sign. And I suspect both these planets aspect each other quite closely. Where would we find the roots of the many conspiracy theories that RFK has promoted? I suspect in part it is this Scorpio placement of Saturn and Mars, and the Pluto quincunxes. That deep penetrating energy will be somewhat undermined by the squares to Neptune, and we also need to look at the Uranus-Neptune square, which can sometimes struggle with reality. If we start looking at Robert's progressions now, something very interesting happened as his life unfolded. When Robert was born, Neptune was going direct in his chart. But if we progress his chart to age around 10, Neptune turns retrograde. This retrograde motion was effective around late October of 1963, and his uncle, President JFK, was murdered in November 1963. Jupiter was retrograde in his birth chart, but it turned direct around September 1977 when Robert was 23 years old, and it was shortly after this that his first book was published. He also made a film, and there are various Wikipedia mentions of increased travelling and broadening of his horizons at this time. Saturn was direct in his natal chart, but it began moving retrograde in early August of 1984, and it was in this year that he was sentenced for heroin possession. This was a point in his life when he began to turn around. He became sober and began working with environmental groups. Why am I bringing this to your attention? Because Uranus is now changing its position. Uranus was retrograde in his birth chart, but it has now started turning direct. In fact, it began its direct motion when Robert was around the age of 70. This would have been late January 2023. And we can see that this inner compulsion coincides with a time when Robert has decided to enter politics and run for president. We are hampered so much by the lack of a birth time, but there are a number of aspects that are drawing closer in his progressions that are very important. One of these is that his progressed Mars is moving into a trine with Pluto. These two planets are actually in a square aspect in his natal chart, so this aspect is very important. It clearly shows a great determination, even a ruthlessness, to achieve a goal. Progressed Venus is in the area of forming a square to his natal Chiron, and these two have that conjunction in the natal chart, so this is important and not necessarily helpful. Progressed Chiron is around the area of his natal Sun. We could see this enriching his campaign with qualities of healing and compassion, allowing a sensitivity to come across. Now, if Robert was actually born late in the day of 17th of January, it could well be that these aspects are separating and out of the way by November when people vote. But there is one aspect in the progressed chart that's troubling me, and so if we switch to that now, the noon positions show the progressed Sun is separating away from a quincunx to progressed Saturn by just a few minutes. This aspect shows hard work, potentially overwork. Our vigour and stamina would really be put to the test. Ideally, we'd like to see a little bit more distance put between that Sun and Saturn around the 5th of November, which would be the case if Robert was born later in the day. That Venus-Pluto trine will do no harm and could speak of deepening relationships. The solar arcs are emphasising the amount of energy available for Robert this year. Using 8th harmonic aspects, solar arc Mars is moving over the area of his natal Sun and moving on to conjunct Mercury. We could expect a huge boost of energy, of drive and determination, of powerful and enthusiastic communication and oratory. And solar arc Mercury, semi-square to natal Pluto, will add that powerful dynamic to our speech and to our capacity to persuade and influence with our words and communications. Solar arc Uranus is making an aspect with natal Mars at this time, and we could see resolute will, again, driven to achieve a target, a goal, and to be rigid and resolute in this pursuit. Will the transiting planets be helpful to Robert in 2024? Well, Uranus and Jupiter are going to conjunct each other in the sign of Taurus next spring. This will be exact around the 20th or the 21st of April. And this conjunction will trine Robert's Chiron. And Jupiter will then go on to trine his node and Venus and the Sun and Mercury. So we would expect April and May of next year to be a very favourable time for him. And he will go on to experience a Jupiter return as Jupiter moves into Gemini. So again, we have a fortunate transit for growth, for optimism, buoyancy, for success. That Jupiter return will play out over a few months, and so it will be exact in August of 2024, and then again in late November 2024, and finally in April of the following year. On election day in November, it will not be in orb within a degree of his natal Jupiter. However, it will be in orb of his progressed Jupiter. And that transiting Uranus will form a trine to a series of his points in Capricorn, starting with Chiron, but moving through the node, the Venus, and his Sun too. These Uranian energies will be alive in May and June and July. Life will be speeded up intensely. Uranus is electric, stimulating, original, all qualities which Robert will greatly benefit from. And Uranus will retrograde on its position at the beginning of September. So by early November, it is around, again, a most helpful aspect. And heavyweight Pluto is conjuncting his natal Mercury at the start of the year. And although it moves on into the early degrees of Aquarius, it will return to the late Capricorn positions. So by early September, it is within a degree of orb of his natal Mercury. And in fact, if Robert was born later in the day, it would be exactly conjunct his Mercury this month. So his communications with people would be deep, powerful. He would have penetrating insight into how to communicate his message to the population. And Pluto's effect would be around even in early November, election month. Now, where is Saturn for Robert during 2024? There's good news and bad news. Saturn will trine his natal Mars around April-May time. And this will be very useful because it will allow Robert to focus clearly and purposefully on what he wishes to achieve. He'll be able to streamline his energies in order to focus in on the desired goal. And by retrograde motion, those purposeful and determined energies will be around in late August and September too. But Saturn is also going to square his natal Jupiter. And this aspect is going to put a real brake on Robert's desire to expand, to enjoy growth and success in his campaign. So it's likely that he's going to have to make a great deal of tweaks and adjustments to his model as he moves along. This aspect will first be exact in May 2024. And by retrograde motion, it will be influencing him in August, September time too. And lastly, transiting Neptune is providing, by sextile, a little bit of assistance to his Sun and his Mercury. This would likely have a softening effect on how Robert came across. It would add a certain imagination, intuition, and a sensitivity in how he comes across to the public. As there's no significant impact by eclipses during 2024, let's move on and look at the positions for 5th of November in the ephemeris. As mentioned earlier, transiting Jupiter is just out of an orb of 1 degree to conjuncting his natal Jupiter, but it is within orb of his progressed Jupiter. The sextile from transiting Neptune to his Sun is within a 1 degree orb on the actual day. And if Robert was born later in the day, transiting Pluto too would be in orb of his natal Mercury. So far, so good. But something very interesting is happening to transiting Mars at the end of next year. Whilst it doesn't affect Robert's chart on the day of 5th November, we have a very interesting position here. Mars is going to turn retrograde on the 7th of December. It will be around 6 degrees of Leo at the time. Now, in those first few days of November, transiting Mars opposed transiting Pluto. The exact opposition is on the 3rd of November, and this is a difficult aspect across the world stage. We could potentially see increases in aggression or violence during this time. And although Mars moves on slowly into the sign of Leo and breaks from the opposition, it is of course going to turn retrograde, and in that motion it will again form this opposition in early January of 2025. Mars will turn direct again on the 24th of February. It will be at 17 degrees Cancer. The degrees between 17 of Cancer and 6 of Leo are therefore Mars's retrograde shadow. And so this particular section of a natal chart is going to be brought to the forefront for people who have planets between the positions of 17 degrees of Cancer and 6 degrees of Leo, which indeed Robert has. This Mars retrograde cycle is going to bring to the forefront that Uranus, potentially his moon, and that opposition to the Capricorn stellium too. Neptune will be involved as well. In fact, this Mars retrograde cycle is going to light up his whole Tsquare in his natal chart with a lot of planets involved. This could be troublesome for Robert, and I'd be interested to see how this one plays out. Mars will begin activating this Tsquare in his chart by conjunction to that Uranus in the month of October. Will we see some conflict and difficulty beginning at this time? I would so have loved to arrive at a decision during this video, but a reasonably accurate birth time is critical for this. You can see the intensity of aspects and transits. His chart is receiving powerful impulses from every direction, but a difficult transit, for example Neptune squaring his ascendant, could call the whole thing off. I also looked at the synastry between his chart and the United States chart. There always tends to be interlinks between any president and the US's chart. And we do have those interconnections. In fact, presidents of the United States tend to have strong aspects in the composite chart between themselves and the United States. We find planets on the angles, the midheaven, the ascendant or descendant, but we would need an exact birth time in order to produce a composite between the United States and Robert. Let's hope that a birth time surfaces soon. So there we have it. This gentleman is being provided with some marvellous energy from the outer planets. And everywhere I look, the activity is so intense. If the time of his ascendant and midheaven could be established, I would feel so much more confident in making my decision. I've developed a mini obsession over the astrology of the Kennedy family now. I'm about to move house, so I will have a few busy weeks where I can't do much. But when I'm back in action, I'd like to take a closer look at RFK's family heritage. And the chart for the United States is also affected next year in a very significant way, and particularly as we move into the final part of the year, we see some important points being affected, and that too is something that I'm going to take a closer look at. So in the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely Halloween. Look after yourselves. Take good care.